Awesome. Great. Well, let's get right into it, right? So the title of today's webinar is, right, a deep dive on all you need to know, right, on VMware Cloud on AWS. And I kind of wanted to start with some level setting, right? So when we're talking about VMware Cloud on AWS, it's a service that's now been out for a couple years, right? It's a jointly engineered solution from VMware and from AWS together. So Tony, I'm just curious. Let's start with you. So when we're talking about VMware Cloud on AWS, who would you say someone is that could readily get a lot of value from VMware Cloud on AWS first, right? What is a customer or someone that might use this service sort of look like? What's the landscape?
Well, I would say I think you would start with someone who has obviously a strong VMware footprint, good operational skills, maybe looking to make that initial move into cloud. They've been dabbling with it a bit, but they're not completely sure how to make the move, and they're looking to continue to utilize those VMware skills that they have. And there's a couple other things that could maybe drive that. Say that migration might be coming about because they need a data center expansion. I was actually reading a survey that had been done recently by Faction, who's a VMware partner, and it seems like the biggest use case right now, or one of the biggest drivers, is expanding the data center, whether that be for the hope for growth that every company, every customer would love to see, but also maybe it's just time to get out of the data center. You're coming up, you're in a colo or something, and it's time to move out of that. And another big use case is disaster recovery. That seems to be the two biggest drivers. So I would start there.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. What do you think, Kevin? Any color to add there? Anything else that you've seen as well?
Yeah. So just to kind of touch on those, if we break things down into three pillars, like migrations, data center extension, or disaster recovery, and then you can kind of even subdivide that depending on what customers are really looking to do. I think if we're using kind of the recent events with COVID, a lot of customers seeing that need for expansion. So whether it's not, obviously a global pandemic is not something that happens every single year, but they might be reevaluating costs of colo facilities or commercial real estate space for existing data centers. They might be reevaluating. So again, keying in on that data center kind of consolidation, data center expansion, a lot of different use cases, and we are seeing a lot of growth there. And then just like Tony said, disaster recovery and kind of DR as a service. So whether that's we want to bring it up, not only our what's running our data center, but maybe it also encompasses virtual desktops, so different services like Horizon, leveraging VMC to kind of provide a single DR option for all the workloads in the data center and really beyond.
Right. No, that's great, Kevin. And then just a tiny bit of housekeeping for anybody that we've got out there. You can use the Q&A panel here at the bottom of the webinar. If you've got questions, you want to throw them out, feel free to go ahead and throw those out in the Q&A panel, and we can get to those as soon as we can. And, just to add some color to what Kevin and Tony were saying, I really think your point was well received, Tony, about VMware operational capability, right? So when we look at the components that make up VMware Cloud and AWS, you have vSphere, right, which pretty much everyone knows is the hypervisor. You've got NSX with the software-defined networking. You also have vSAN, right, providing that software-defined storage. So we can see that from VMware's strategy, they've obviously included all the pieces that they're saying, hey, if you want to build a private cloud on premises, you're going to be doing it this way. You're very likely going to have some sort of hyperconverged technology, some sort of SDN, and a hypervisor, right? And they've basically taken those components and said, hey, how can we wrap a lifecycle and a service around this and sort of go forward from there? So it's kind of one of those things where you don't necessarily need operational skills in vSAN or in NSX, right. To most part, right? You need the ability to manage a network, but to your point, that's a very well taken point, Tony. You're not going to be replacing drives in a server, so you don't have to worry about that aspect of vSAN, but you do have to worry about policy selection just like you would have to worry about, different configurations of a virtual machine if you were using, AWS compute or, just native virtual machines on AWS, right? Like, what's the difference? You still have to know the configurations and how it's going to work together, right? So from Kevin, from your perspective, when we're talking about a migration, right? And someone's thinking, hey, maybe I've got like a lease, maybe I've got a time frame, maybe I want like certain applications that I just got to move where I don't want to have to get those translated into a PaaS or, a function as a service or do a rewrite of the app, right? I've got VMs, I've got the apps on them. I just want to get them moved, right? So like, I mean, when does a migration sort of come into play there, and how might that look? What are the tipping points of when someone might go through like a migration, right?
Yep. Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So if we kind of put it, I'm just going to refer to my previous comments. So if we put this in kind of like the cloud migration bucket, and I think there's a couple different ways to think about that. And if you start breaking things down by and kind of looking at things, not necessarily from a individual virtual machine layer, but it's really critical to think of things in terms of applications and make that be the focus when you're talking about any kind of cloud migration. So really kind of evaluating, okay, what kind of applications do we have? How do they function? What kind of network connectivity? What are they communicating with? Data locality, things of that nature. These are all kind of common things that you would go through. I think what really shines for VMC is it gives a business an opportunity to leverage some of the, again, kind of operational consistency from what they have on-prem. And it gives them a landing spot that they're familiar with and, using technologies and a vendor that they're also familiar with in order to help enhance that kind of cloud native service consumption type model. So where you can ease into the cloud, dare I say, you can kind of get there and maybe further evaluate things and then figure out where it makes sense to start taking, advantage of native cloud services. But from an actual migration standpoint, so I talked about application, networking is another big thing. So two major things I think worth noting for VMC, obviously NSX, software defined networking and security, that's going to be there. And then I really don't like using the term magic when talking about technology, but the magic sauce of migration is really HCX. So hybrid cloud extension, and you have a plethora of options when it comes to migration, whether you want to do individual workloads, bulk migrations, the networking associated with that, and how you want to handle the networking. There's different options, layer 2 extension, where you want to handle like default gateways. I won't get too into the weeds in the networking piece, but a lot of options, a lot of functionality HCX brings to the table that really makes that a pretty seamless component, which really networking is pretty difficult, especially when you're talking about extending even a data center to a native public cloud. HCX makes it a lot easier.
Right.
Yeah,
no, that's great. Go ahead, Tony.
Oh, I was just going to add one more thing in there about the HCX part. I mean, I know it's difficult to believe, but there are still folks running on, and I say that jokingly, pre-6.0, VMware 6.0, and HCX can reach all the way back into the 5.x and seamlessly migrate those virtual machines into a VMC on AWS environment. So that's going to be big for some folks.
Yeah, absolutely, Tony. I mean, you look at, there's plenty of folks that are still running like 6.0 and 5.5, right? And I'm like, those have been into support for quite some time now. So they go into that phase, right, in the VMware lifecycle of technical advisory. In other words, we'll help you try to leave. And that's about as much as we're going to give you. And we're not going to give you a whole bunch else, right? So yeah, that's a great point. I mean, and Kevin, your point is awesome about like networking, right? I mean, if I'm honestly looking at a cloud migration and saying, I have a big VMware footprint, right? Plenty of public clouds have offerings that say, let us take a look at the workloads you have and let's get them over here. They don't often say that, like, by the way, you're changing L3. You were in this subnet today, you're going to be in a different subnet tomorrow. And then you find out along the way what used IP addresses instead of DNS, right? So it's just kind of like, those are the things that you uncover along the way, as you're doing a migration. With VMC, you have the capability of saying, hey, we can actually use the same IP space in both locations, perform a seamless migration, and then cut over the network, right? I mean, I'm like, that's awesome, right? Now you
Yep.
say it like it's easy like that, you know, but it takes a little bit of work to get that going, right? So
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And for anybody out there that's thinking um, that's somewhat modernized and thinks, you know, IP address changes aren't a big deal. I think the reality is, talking with our customers, and if you're listening and you're out there, you know, you're certainly not alone, is what runs in, you know, your traditional vSphere environments on-prem, a lot of super old legacy stuff that's hard coded per IP addresses. So, you know, in a lot of cases, that's really important. You know, being able to maintain an IP address. Again, there's different ways to cut the cake to support that, but that's an important, really important factor for a lot of companies when thinking about, you know, workload mobility and migration.
yeah, no, that's great. So I know we had a couple more things to get through, but I'm gonna take a second here for Clint's question. So Clint had a question here that was, so obviously going cloud native is best, right? 100% agree with that, right? If you're using PaaS, you're using cloud the way it's supposed to use, using scalable services, that's the way it's designed to be used, right? Say we have a small mini data center footprint we'd like to get rid of, moving to the cloud in a like-for-like fashion would help us, you know, make a move much faster. What sort of a higher OpEx cost can we expect to see while using this offering compared to a native cloud offering? And it's a super great question. And it's one that's very, very relevant, right? And I think this is part of the reason that during the design of the solution, right, VMware and AWS together said, hey, we're going to give you a 25 gigabit per second ENI free of charge between whatever availabilities, like inside of an availability zone. We'll give that to you so that you can say, hey, we're bringing up virtual machines that we're just trying to chunk over, right? If we've got a big chunk of workload that we're looking to get over, that's going to help solve that problem while we're getting to that cloud native capabilities where we're using more native services, right? So the answer from an OpEx perspective, right? I mean, we can sort of cut straight to some of the questions around how the solution's, you know, priced and sold, which is it's more around it's per host, right? So if you think of like a service, a lot of times it's like gigabits, you know, transferred, right? Or virtual machine size per hour, right? Those are things that are very, very normal from a costing perspective. With VMware Cloud and AWS, it's per host because you're getting a bare metal host in one of AWS's data centers and having VMware vSphere installed directly on it and used. So like it's literally you're getting your own dedicated hosts for every single host in the cluster. There's no, you know, magic, you know, a nested virtualization that's happening. You're getting those nodes. So the way that it's charged is either on demand or 1 or 3 year reservations per node, right? And right now there are 2 different node sizes. There's the i3 metal and the i3en metal, right? And it's basically for it's the i3en is the newer storage dense, right? So to answer your question, from an OpEx perspective, you can certainly come to understand that pretty quickly by checking out the pricing. The thing that honestly I like, and Kevin, Tony, looking for your feedback here. A lot of times, I mean, Advizex is a great partner of VMware's. We're involved in a lot of their roadmap and like forecasting sessions. And a lot of that is very much NDA, and we're not allowed to share that. And the VMware Cloud and AWS team literally has their roadmap published on the front page of the website. You can go and say, here's the features we're working on. Here's what we're trying to get to. So it really is sort of a really cool breakdown of, you know, hey, this is where we're going. If there's a need that we're looking at, like we're understanding that, we're documenting it, and we're keeping it right in the limelight. So Kevin, any of your comments around that, around OpEx and sort of, you know, using VMware in the cloud? Oh, you're muted, Kevin, I think.
Sorry about that. Like you're mentioning, billing unit being per host. That's not to say that there aren't some other additional costs that you might incur directly from AWS, depending on what you're using, native cloud services. But the costing model is greatly simplified. It's easier to forecast, so to say. So that's another thing from a costing perspective that almost every customer that we talk to when talking about cloud is their top concern is, well, the billing is a question mark and everything is an estimate. When you're buying, or when you're, as far as VMC as a solution goes, buying at a host at a time, it's more predictable. Doing a reserved instance at the host level, you have a lot more freedom to deploy, you know, your workloads up and down depending on resource utilization. You know that you have a set cost, it's a fixed cost for whatever. It's either on demand 1 year or 3 year. On demand is obviously somewhat more variable, but still it's per host. So as long as you're, 3 hosts, as long as you're not, deploying workloads that requires more hosts, your on-demand cost is still going to be fairly predictable. So predictability is definitely a bonus if that's a big concern, depending on, what size, like what your footprint's going to look like in the cloud and how you're actually going to consume it.
Sure. Great,
Yeah,
Kevin.
a couple of things I'd add there, Joe. Yeah. So on the roadmap piece, I mean, if you've ever worked for a partner or an OEM, we've all sat through these NDA sessions on the roadmap and what's coming, and they want to keep it a big secret until all the major announcements are made. As far as I know, and I'm sure somebody will correct me on this, but this product, VMC on AWS, is the only one I know of where they not only publish, but they make a big deal of the roadmap, what's coming, what you can expect. And I think that's a big advantage for customers. I mean, and you can make suggestions, you can make recommendations for improvements that you'd like to see. Also, with the introduction of the i3 EN metal instance, there's now a 2-node cluster. So you can scale all the way down to just a couple of nodes. Now that's fairly new, and there's some restrictions around it. For example, if you scale up right now today, there's some restrictions. If you scale up to a 3 or a 4-node cluster, you can't go back to the 2-node. But that things like that will change as the offering's been out there for a while. And then the third thing I would add is if you go to the cloud.vmware.com site, there's actually a pricing calculator there. So you can, if you know your workload and you know some basic characteristics of your workloads, you can get a really close estimate of what what your monthly cost is going to be, or your 1 or 3 year reservation cost is going to be. So it's very upfront.
Yeah, all great points, Tony. And I mean, honestly, we're looking at this, and VMware running on AWS is basically, this was the first VMware solution running on a public cloud provider, like bare metal on nodes, right? So in the following of that, we saw a couple things happen, right? Cloud Simple was born, Cloud Simple was sold, Azure came up with their own VMware on Azure service, right? So I'm like, so the precedent is there, honestly, for people saying like, hey, even in these other public cloud providers, they're saying running VMware on a public cloud makes sense, right? So I guess, Clint, back to your question of, from an OpEx perspective, does it make sense? I'm like, I think it does. And the rationale behind that is like, it wouldn't be an offering in multiple catalogs in multiple places if it didn't make sense, right? So I think they're trying to just say, hey, we're trying to capitalize big time on the ability to preserve your operational capability as someone that understands, VMware products and services and how they work, and simply just translate that to a different thing. I will add one other note though, which kind of dovetails into our next section, for the conversation, which is around VMware Cloud versus traditional infrastructure, right? And how that kind of looks, and what maybe some of the differences are. And as we're thinking through that, one of the things that really jumps out to me is when hyper-converged infrastructure sort of hit the scene. We had this interesting thing where we had a 3-tier environment for so long. We had compute, SAN, storage, right? And storage arrays were completely separate. And in order for hyperconverged to make sense from an OpEx perspective and a budgeting perspective, to your exact point, Clint, you had to basically get to a point where you would say, okay, storage is up, compute is up, let's buy it both together at the same time, right? It's gotten a little wider with this offering, right? Because VMC includes all the software licensing that's included to run that. Now, there's capabilities that they've built in to say like, hey, if you've got a bunch of licensing, we can get some discounting, right? Like there's some of that was built in. But from the perspective of saying, now I need to align not only compute and storage and my VMware licensing, gets a little bit trickier, right? So from making sure that is a good move, a lot of times it's going to be like, hey, do all 3 of these come up close together? Is this going to be a wise investment? Are there things I can and still need to use these things for? All very valid and relevant questions today when we're looking at that. So as far as VMC goes, traditional infrastructure versus VMware Cloud. I know, Kevin, you've been working a lot with VMware Cloud Foundation, right? Which is very, very similar to the VMC offering. It's not exact. It's not a direct replica, right? They kind of forked the build and said, all right, here you go, VCF, VMC. What are some of your thoughts on maybe some differences there?
Yeah, sure. So I think the big difference, and something you kind of touched on a little bit earlier from an operation standpoint, is what you need to know about and kind of like the care and feeding. So you're no longer swapping out hard drives. You're no longer SSHing into a host in VMC. That you don't even get that access. So someone might make the argument, oh well, I'm losing a little bit of control. But, I always try to counter that with, is that work that's actually valuable to, your business? So is it business value added work that you're doing? And with VMC, they're basically saying, let us handle that. And you focus on managing your applications and the key components of your platform that actually run that application. And so some differentiators between VCF, obviously, if you're running that on-prem, you still are doing, all of the physical plumbing, all the networking, all the storage configurations, everything on the back end, physical hard drives, failures, managing failures, managing your own response times and SLAs about responding to failures. These are all things that VMware, in conjunction with AWS, are kind of taking off of your plate and saying, we'll handle that. Here are our SLAs. And I think in a lot of cases, they're better than, you could even provide in your own data center because, they have people, staff, these are staff facilities, things are happening, around the clock. And it's really, really hard to beat that. So I think that's a really big differentiator between VCF on-prem versus VMC. And I kind of always, it really all comes back to, what's the value added work that you're doing, and let that be the focus when we're talking about VMC.
So Joe, you're muted.
Oh, my bad. Tony, anything you've got to add to that? I know you've been in that space for a long time too, right? So I think all of us have. So any thoughts there?
Well, yeah, it doesn't take very long to get to lose the thrill of changing disk drives or hardware, when they go bad. So you can get over that really quick. And updates they're always painful. All right. So does the HVA firmware, is that going to work with the operating system drivers, which is that going to work with the latest security patch of blah, 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 blah. And VMC takes care of all of that. And I think for most people, I know, at least for me, I was happy to give that up, that kind of work.
Got it. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know that one of the things that comes up a lot of times in my perspective and difference between on-prem architecture and maybe as a service here with VMC, one of the things that we get asked, almost repeatedly, like, I do have a VCDX, right? And VCDX is like that design expert certification from VMware that says you've thought through the business rationale, you've thought through the design requirements and constraints, and you're going to make this work for what the business actually needs. And one of those key questions that we oftentimes come to is, hey, what's an acceptable amount of failure? N+1, N+2, N+3, 2 data centers, 3 data centers, like what is an acceptable amount of failure? And a lot of times folks will just come to, well, hey, for our cluster, it's going to be N+1, and then we replicate offsite. That's fine. That's a pretty good answer. When we're thinking through this in the VMC perspective, the next question that comes up is, okay, well, how about if you have N+1 during maintenance when you're actually performing an upgrade? What about then, right? So it's actually N+2 node failures if you're trying to account for failure during maintenance of a particular node with hyperconverged. And and one of the cool things that many people don't even know about VMware Cloud and AWS is like, hey, when the maintenance is being performed on your behalf, again, that's pretty cool. You get an email that says, we're moving from this version of vSphere to this version of vSphere. It'll happen at this time. Have a nice day, right? We'll let you know when it's done. Wouldn't that be sweet? So you don't have to align the sun, moon, and stars of firmware, drivers, SAN array, everything else, right? You have to, all that prep work is just gone, right? You don't have to do that anymore. When they're performing the upgrade for you, they will actually add a node to the cluster, and they won't charge you for that. So that you can say, all right, I've got, a cluster where if I was running this thing full tilt, 99% CPU on every single host, which you are entitled to do so, if that's what the kind of workload you want to run in that cluster, then they're going to add another node, right? So that you can say, hey, we're bringing resources to bear so that you're not impacted by an upgrade that we have to perform for you on your behalf. So it really very cool. To Kevin's point about operational fixes, right? How many times has a dead host meant, hey, how long is that host going to be a dead host? What if we have, business hours response instead of a 4-hour response time on that piece of gear, right? Well, now it's like for 4 hours where we could potentially suffer an outage or data loss or something like that, right? Or data unavailability while that's happening. With VMware Cloud and AWS, you lose a host, it drops. You literally just have another one just added back into the cluster, right? So from a perspective of operational management and handling failures, super fantastic, right? I just, it's really cool to think that like, hey, this is something where a lot of the day in, day out things that I used to have to care about, but didn't want to have to care about, I have to do, right? I want to get to the point where I'm responding to the business faster. We're provisioning things, we're provisioning services, we're getting new virtual machines stood up faster than ever without folks having to wait, right? How often have you been in a situation where a cluster that you have perhaps on premises has been completely redlined and you've thought, oh no, now I need more hardware, right? But you only know that like once you're to the point where it's like redlining and you're like, okay, this is a problem.
Right.
Thinking through that, like you're like, oh, what if I just need to scale that out? Which I mean, kind of jumps to the next point. Tony, what do you think about that from like a scalability perspective, right? I mean, what are your thoughts around that?
Well, I mean, it's most customers, and when I was a customer, I didn't have extra hosts or storage arrays or disk trays sitting around, network switches to add in. So the idea that when I hit a certain predefined level, the cluster just automatically can add in additional hosts with storage. I mean, that just makes that worry go away. And at the same time, if I hit a point to where usage decreases for whatever reason at some certain level, if I don't need, make up a number. If I don't need 10 hosts anymore, I only need 9. That 10th host can go away, and I'm not charged for it. Yeah, I mean that's one of the great things about it. And to your earlier point about the maintenance piece, I mean I think that's more in that cloud mentality. I mean, if you have, for example, a host that fails, like you said, a new one is swapped in, and somebody doesn't come along and repair that old one and put it back in the cluster. That one that was taken out of the cluster it's just gone, right? It never comes back in. You get a brand new host. Same way with updates and things like that. So yeah, it just makes the whole process much easier.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, from an on-prem perspective, is Kevin, I know you've got a lot of experience with NSX as well, right? So what you're thinking about that, like from a difference in on-prem, if someone goes to set up NSX on premises versus in a VMC offering, what are the differences there?
Yep. Yeah. So I'd like to kind of start tackling that from like an operations standpoint, right? So I think one of the things we commonly see is, especially maybe for customers that might not have NSX on-prem, is there's some blended responsibility between maybe the teams that traditionally manage vSphere environment, and obviously the networking team and even the security team. So when we start talking about firewalling, wrapping security policies around workloads running in VMC, it really starts to become a kind of unified effort. So communication obviously needs to be good. What we don't like to see and what we don't see as successful is kind of having that vSphere team try to manage all that stuff on their own. There really is, I mentioned before, HCX and even NSX, it does make a lot of networking challenges easier, but you still have the same networking challenges. There's still traffic engineering to think about. There's still routing to think about. There's IP space, subnetting. All of this stuff really does need to be planned, just like as you even would go to public cloud. It's not necessarily let's spin it up and then click, click, click. We're done, we're up and running, and this is how I connect. There's different ways to connect your data center to VMC on AWS, whether that's VPN, whether it's direct connect. And there's a lot of conversation that goes into, what is best for me if I'm the customer. What's going to be the best solution? What kind of bandwidth are we going to need? Does it make sense to do a direct connect? And then you take a step further. How are we going to design the direct connect? Do we want redundancy? Do we want terminations across different regions? What are other kind of cloud native services do we think that we might want to start leveraging? There's a lot of, not making it sound daunting, but it's something that does need some thoughtfulness, wrapped around and some effort put into, how do we want to handle that? But again, and there's too many ways to kind of make a deep dive here on just an overview, but there are a lot of ways that a lot of flexibility where NSX can help bridge the networking, or even extend, if you're an existing NSX customer, extend that networking and integrate natively on-prem in VMC.
Yeah, that's that's great, Kevin. Fantastic. I mean, I know that folks have often thought, well, hey, do I need NSX on premises to connect this in? The answer is no, right? Even if you're going to do L2 extensions with NSX that's provided with VMC, they'll give you the appliance to run on premises, so you can just run it and stretch those layer 2 networks out if you need to. So all good stuff. I know one of the things that we talked about previously was around scale and growth, and maybe some of the differences there, right? And then we kind of have a quip on our team that if you never scale in, it's just growth. So the understanding that, if you're using the cloud for scaling in and out, you're using it the way it's supposed to be used, right? So with that, and pardon my voice here, breaking up here, from a VMC perspective, what, Kevin and Tony, what do you guys think about? Is it big cloud? The point that Clint made about, it being cloud native is best, right? Like almost even moving away from virtual machines, right? Containers and databases, right? Web front ends, web applications, right? Application services entirely in the cloud, right? That's what people are moving to. So what's the thought here about kind of this big cloud versus, the tinier, more little chunks of cloud, right? With cloud native.
Well, I would say, VMC on AWS makes for a good transition. Not everyone is ready to move to cloud today, but there's certainly, I think, the tool set there, and I believe you're going to hear a lot more about things like Tanzu, Kubernetes, containers, all of that at VMworld. As a matter of fact, there's an announcement. There's a VMware announcement today, which I haven't had a chance to read yet, but it's supposed to come out today, about something called developer-ready infrastructure. So there's, I'm assuming they're going to add to the tool set that allows you to do that kind of thing. So, I don't know about the word big cloud, but I think it's certainly there. It certainly gives you some of the capabilities around that, transitioning from on-prem infrastructure and the way that applications are built to run on that into the whole cloud native infrastructure. That's a long journey, and it generally takes longer than my experience, and I'm not a cloud native developer by any stretch, but that journey, I think it's safe to say, generally takes longer than most people think it's going to take. So VMC on AWS does provide a good transition platform and a period for that, I think.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that too. And we say big cloud. I think maybe it is in the sense that, or it could be in the sense that it is a mature true cloud offering. So if you're talking about, services offered by cloud providers, it is just that. I think the one thing that stands out, and Joe mentioned earlier about different, VMware on Azure, and different other similar solutions with other major cloud providers. I think what's really unique to this VMC solution is that it is the only solution that is jointly engineered with VMware. So you go cloud.vmware.com, we talked about the sizing. It's a truly native experience, where the others, there's some other nuances that could potentially go into that, where this is is a native solution, jointly engineered by AWS and VMware. And it really shows when you start from an operations perspective and you start going through that. And I think it also, whether it's short-term or long-term, Tony, you mentioned kind of a tool to transition, 100, 200%, I totally agree. But I think there is also, depending on how well customers are at, managing OpEx, it could be a use case. It could be a long-term use case, depending on what kind of workloads you have. It really is and it's such an architect's answer. It depends. But I mean, the reality of it is it really does. Obviously a lot of things that we've talked about, at least thus far, are kind of dial tones on what we're seeing in the industry and with our customers.
Yeah. So one of the things, when VMC was first announced, I mean, almost all of the so-called pundits and analysts out there that I read about said that this was just a mechanism to move things off of VMware and away from VMware.
It was the next vCloud Air, right?
Yes, the next vCloud Air. And I haven't, well, so first of all, you don't read that at all anymore. And I haven't heard anybody do an analysis of how much, like you said, Kevin, moves from on-premises into VMC and then just stays there because it just works, right? And that'd be something I'd really be interested if there were some numbers around that. Of all the things that moved into VMC on AWS, this percentage of them, or this percentage of customers have said, okay, this works. This is what we want. We're just primarily staying here.
Right. No, that's great. I mean, fantastic input from both of you. I mean, when I think about big cloud too, I mean, I've seen a lot of really big cloud bills made up of very, very small pieces. So, I mean, I'll refer to one engineer that I respect a lot had a quote that was, "There's no mathematical equation for laziness." And he meant that when he said laziness, he didn't mean like as in like somebody that didn't want to do their job. He meant someone that said like, I need to do the math. Like I need to ensure that I'm asking for as much resource as is required. And that's true regardless of the node size we're working with here, right? Where there's a little bit more give is in VMC, like we were mentioning, because it's per host, you're not paid from CPU utilization on that host, right? You don't pay based on that. You pay based on the available cores that are in a box that you say, this node type has this many CPUs in it, and I know that I can run them with about this much certainty, right? To say that this is how it's going to cook. We all know that NSX and vSAN, there's a little bit of CPU that's consumed in that host, right, for that. But effectively, we can run those hosts as hot as we want while we have them in available. And there's something to be said for that, where we can say, you know what, we are given the power to how much we want to oversubscribe. That's not an option that you are given when you're just using, an IaaS solution like, AWS Compute, like, right? Like, I mean, that's AWS's responsibility to say, we're responsible for managing the hypervisor and everything underneath it. You don't need to know about how, what the relationship is with the underlying infrastructure, because you're being told you're being guaranteed this from a virtual machine perspective. So it's kind of that nice middle ground where it relinquishes some of that control back to the administrator to say, I can run these hosts as hot as I want. I can have a good understanding about what the specs are in this node and what kind of expected performance could be derived from them. So when we talk about big cloud, right? I mean, it's sure that's a great move. But like you were saying earlier, Kevin, sometimes it's really a hedge against uncertainty and saying, we're not sure if we need this many services, what we need. We see a lot of customers using reserved instances on VMware Cloud and AWS for what their core always on services are. right? And then when they're using it to expand out a cluster or to bring up a cluster for test dev or actually use it for DR, right? Great use case there where we've got some services that are running all the time in a secondary environment, but we can scale that out and add those nodes in at 15 minutes a node when we have a DR exercise, right? That lets you meet a lot of RTOs that most folks are trying to hit when there's an actual break glass, pull lever, fail over to a different site happens, right? So just a lot there for sure.
Yeah, and I'm really interested. I mean, maybe just a little tangent, but you know, VMware made the announcement. It's probably been a month ago now. The purchase of Datrium. Datrium had a really interesting DR service built on a VMC on AWS, and I'm super interested to see how that integrates into the whole VMC platform. I think that's going to be a really neat product, and maybe next week or a couple of weeks to VMworld, maybe they'll make some announcements around it. But I think there's a possibility there for that to be a real benefit to, especially some of the smaller customers that are considering VMC.
Yeah, absolutely. I know a lot of I knew some folks over there at Datrium, and I know that the big value that VMware saw in them and bringing them and picking them up, right, was around that orchestration to VMC.
Exactly.
And saying, hey, we figured out how to orchestrate and scale and bring up from perhaps a stubbed out network and a couple VMs running on AWS, right? We figured out how to say, hey, let's bring it up from there, right? And I know they were using their data storage platform, which VMware sadly put a bulletin in, but hey, what can you say? They wrote vCAN. So
but on what side of Datrium you worked on, whether it was a good thing or not.
Right. Yep. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. But I'm excited for that. I think that's pretty cool. I mean, and perhaps on that note, I mean, Kevin and Tony, you know, what are your thoughts on the DR as a service model? Right. We saw that there was an i3EN node that just was recently announced, and that was as a result to before that there was i3 Metal and R5 Metal nodes were available, and R5 Metal nodes are no longer available, because basically that was vSAN nodes that were backed by EBS volumes. And it was expensive. Pretty much every configuration we came up against, we would say it actually just makes sense to go with more i3 nodes than it does to use the R5 with EBS backed volumes. So what are your thoughts around the i3EN, what that means for DR as a service, what that means for customers that have storage dense requirements? And then perhaps as an added benefit to those that are here, right? What are your thoughts around i3EN versus perhaps native services, right? Like your Amazon file services, right? Like other things that that we might use as an alternative to a storage dense VMware environment. You know, what are the thoughts there? Where does that fit? When are we using it?
Well, from a DR standpoint, almost every configuration I did when I was working on a DR environment, like you said, came up as storage dense, right? So that always made me have to have more of the i3s than I really needed, or the storage was the determining factor on the number of i3s I needed. So I've gone back and done since the i3EN was announced. I've gone back and done some sizing on some older configurations that we're working on, and you know, in every one of them there was less instances because you had, you know, primarily because you had more storage available, but you also had more CPU and memory available in each one, which ended up less nodes, less cost overall, nearly 9 out of 10 times. Let's just say that I won't say 100%, but 90% of the time. So I think there's definitely a benefit there. As far as the other things you mentioned, I think it comes down to back to what you said about I got to do the math, right? I mean, it puts some more capabilities and abilities in the VMC bucket, but you still have to sit down and look at those capabilities there versus, you know, EBS, EFS, whatever it is, you know, the S3 side of the house, those type of things on just the pure AWS side, and make a decision based on that.
Yep. Yeah. So just to kind of dovetail in, I think, and probably taking a step up just a little bit higher from a capability standpoint. Um, if, not a lot of, I shouldn't say not a lot of, for those customers that are familiar with Site Recovery Manager, site recovery is kind of one of the native solutions offerings for VMC. And as far as storage density, I think that was maybe a challenge, like you mentioned, Joe, about having EBS back volumes, because when you talk about extending the data center for any kind of like burst capacity, or maybe even you're consolidating a colo, the workloads that are on-prem that you want to recover aren't necessarily the same workloads, and the data sets aren't necessarily the same data sets that you would maybe consider for a data center extension use case, for example. So when you start talking about DR, and then you start talking about a lot of the kind of monolithic legacy applications, maybe it has 20 years of data stuffed into a bunch of databases, you're talking about a lot of data that does have to come over. So any efficiencies that you can gain there, and I know, VMC, VMware and AWS, they're doing their part to kind of to see that need in the market and kind of that challenge from like a cost perspective. I think that's going to play a key role in having this be a more attractive solution, at least from a financial standpoint, when you start talking about DR as a service.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a great big use case, right? I mean, and there's just a ton of math that goes into it, to the point that you were making earlier, Tony, right? I mean, just understanding, hey, what fits for a native service? What fits for something that's going to go on the storage that's attached to my clusters up there? Where do I need to be, right? So from a purchasing standpoint, let's talk about that too, because sometimes purchasing something in the cloud is meant to be like the whole swipe your card and go. And VMware Cloud and AWS is no exception for that, right? You can certainly do a pay-go model with VMware Cloud and AWS, but you can only do on-demand consumption with that model, right? Meaning, so you're paying per hour from the moment you push deploy SDDC. You are paying from that moment until when that cluster goes offline, or you shut down that particular cluster in SDDC. So, I mean, so if we talk through some of the ways that it can be purchased, I mean, we know that it can be purchased through like an ELA with VMware. It can be purchased, with SPP tokens, but it can also be purchased as a managed service through a provider, right? And Advizex is one of those managed services providers that can do that. And one of the sort of the key benefits that you can really think about when you're going through that process of saying, hey, how are we going to buy this, is thinking about, from a financial perspective, what's the preferred payment method, right? Because if you can pay for like reserved instances up front, you're obviously going to get the highest amount of discounting. If you want to say, hey, from an OpEx perspective, we like VMC, we like the reserved capacity, but we kind of want to stretch out the payments over time, right? And pay for what we're using as we go along. That's certainly something that we can do as Advizex, to say, hey, you wanted monthly payments for a 10 node cluster? That's not a problem. Like, we can make that happen, right? And that's just a part of what we can offer as a managed service, where otherwise you might just be saying, all right, like this is here's my 1 year reserve cost up front, right? And I get the best discount obviously for paying up front. But there's no secret here, right? This is not uncommon with cloud providers to say, if I pay up front for a chunk of what I'm going to be using, right, I get a higher discount. It's just that simple, because they're going to recognize the revenue, right? So those are the methods that I'm aware of purchasing VMware Cloud and AWS, unless I'm missing any. Kevin, Tony, keep me honest on that, but I'm pretty sure that's right, and that's also when they start and stop. So, yep.
Yeah, I think the swipe your card option, also there's an initial $2,000 charge on that as soon as you swipe that card. That's not recurring. It's just, for whatever reason, it's an initial charge up front, and then you use up those credits as you go. But that might be an issue for some folks. It would certainly be an issue for me if I wanted a test lab, right?
Sure. Yeah, which is a great point, Tony. I mean, they do have a single node environment that they have available for a period of 30 days that you can purchase. So if you're like, hey, I like this idea, this is cool, but I don't know, I want to see layer 2 stretched in, I want to see some of my test dev up there, I want to see the proof of the pudding, right? we can, like, Advizex is awesome at this. We can say, all right, we have the AWS capability to say, we know we can help you with the networking side, right? Our networking team has done a ton of network assessments just recently, even around cloud readiness. So that's one of the things where we can say, hey, if you need help from a network readiness perspective, we can certainly jump in and help there. And then basically, if you need to POC this and say, let's turn it on, let's see it running, let's move some stuff over. Again, something we've got a lot of experience with, and we're happy to help and jump in and say, all right, if you're trying to get stuff over, if you're trying to see that move from one side to another and actually, see the pudding and taste the pudding, hey, there's the proof, right? And a proof of concept, right, is only as good as its like success criteria. So I talk about this all the time with customers, whereas if you're going to have a POC, make sure you actually have defined criteria. You're like, hey, I need to make sure that I can scale out. I can, you've got these things defined, right? Like from a business perspective, if we go this way, what were the requirements driving this decision, right? We want to ensure that we can migrate a batch of 50 virtual machines in one night. That might be a requirement, right? Great test case to say, all right, that's what we need to actually hit our migration deadline from a particular environment. So great questions there, right? But yeah, so all good things, right? So anything I missed there, Kevin or Tony, on that, or is that about it?
The only thing I would add there is on the single node, like you said, it only lasts for 30 days. But the key is at the end of that 30 days, it just disappears. So there's no backup, there's no recovering anything that was on that. At the end of the 30 days, that single host is just gone. So don't leave anything there that you want to try to get back.
Right.
It also can't be scaled out either. So you can't decide that you want to scale that single node out. It really is a dev instance, clear separation of duties. It is dev. It's to kind of get your feet wet. One other thing I did want to mention, though, we were talking about costing, was we didn't talk a lot about a lot of the other like VMware services that are available in VMC. So Log Insight, Network Insight, things that are SaaS based. That might have been something in the past that you previously was either maybe cost prohibitive, or depending on how you wanted to license it, it wasn't in the cards. And with all of that being an as a service model, I think there's some efficiencies definitely to be gained with, maybe now the way it's billed, each of them are built a little bit differently, but you have a little bit more flexibility to say, hey, you know what, I do want to take advantage of the service and we can get it for this many VMs, and it makes a lot more sense, and it's natively integrated. So you don't have to worry about deploying that product. You go to, basically go to the marketplace, the catalog, select that you want to start using it, and, you're kind of off to the races. Previously, it's, you deploy that appliance on-prem, you set it up, there's DNS, there's firewall rules, yada, yada, yada. This is kind of button click. I want to start consuming the service. And then, hey, you know what? I'm done with this service. I'd just like to stop using it. So a lot of flexibility with a lot of the native as a service VMware software as a service options with VMC.
Yeah, that's great, Kevin. I mean, anytime we talk about as a service, you guys know that there's some kind of an SLA attached to that, right? So why not take a few minutes and talk about that for VMware Cloud and AWS, right? So and just as a quick sidebar, this is why, like, at Advizex, from a cloud architecture perspective, we care so much about this, because there are still questions to ask even with offerings that are as simplistic and awesome from a perspective of getting those online as VMC. There's still a lot of questions to ask. There's still a lot of architecture and understanding of data replication, needs of customers, like that, to make sure that we're fulfilling. And when we talk about SLAs, right? So an SLA is 3 nines of availability for a VMC cluster that's in one availability zone. From an AWS architecture perspective, right? Think of an AZ or an availability zone like a data center. To get 4 nines of uptime from an SLA perspective, you actually need a stretched cluster that's going to actually facilitate, right? Like you have a stretched cluster in between 2 availability zones, and that are going to say, all right, hey, we've got enough resources in 2 different data centers, right? There's questions that go along with that, right? So there are, there's definitely some traffic that has to go between. And then there's SLAs that are involved with every single service that we have to have, right? And there's always an insurance of data integrity. How are we going to ensure data integrity on the platform? Because that's not AWS's responsibility. So what kind of things are we going to use to back up and protect our virtual machines that are running on VMC, right? All great questions that need to be answered. And again, those are things and reasons why, Advizex is really committed to the cloud space and understanding and helping customers solve those difficult and challenging problems. So, and I know we've got 4 minutes left. So if anybody's got questions that they want to have us jump into here quickly, go ahead and throw those in the chat. But Kevin and Tony, any, I guess, sort of, final thoughts here as we're sort of wrapping out our time here together today?
I would just one thing to go back to early on in the conversation, you were talking about the one of the validations, what you thought was one of the validations of the success of VMC was the fact that it has, expanded to Azure, Google, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I noticed about a couple of weeks ago that, I guess the best way to say it is VMware's biggest competitor in the HCI space is now offering, has come out with an offer that pretty much parallels this. So to me, that's just even more validation that of the success of this product, as that other folks are doing it now.
Yep. Yeah, I think if I were to say anything in closing, I think all the stuff, we comment about transparency, everything we've talked about today, including the roadmap, check out cloud.vmware.com. Everything from pricing, like Joe talked about and Tony talked about, to the different solutions, to information about all the services. They post everything on there. And then, of course, any other advanced questions, or if you want to engage about, hey, what would this mean if we want to evaluate it, next steps, obviously reach out to us if you're already working with the account executive. If not, and you're new, advizex.com. We have some videos up on YouTube that are somewhat relevant. So, definitely not no lack of information out there.
For sure. And we did have one question came in that was about the 2-node cluster here. So they're asking, hey, is the 2-node cluster basically priced the same way as the other things? And yeah, the answer to that is the 2-node cluster is priced the same as a 3-node cluster. And what it gets you is basically a 33% lower cost of entry, right? So if you wanted to get into VMC at, the lowest cost possible, your best choice there is to say, hey, a 2-node cluster is a fully, scalable production environment that we could get into, right? So that it's priced the same way, on demand, 1 year and 3-year reservations. And it looks like that's about it from a questions perspective. And I know we are coming right up against on time. So Kevin and Tony, thank you both so much for your time. For everyone that was here and asking questions, we definitely appreciate all your time as well. And we look forward to seeing you in future webinars and maybe in some of the live chat at VMworld coming up here at the end of the month, just a couple short weeks away. So thank you all for your time, and we'll be seeing you soon. Take care.